Hey there folks, and welcome to another dive down the MIDI rabbit hole. Today it's the turn of MIDI CCs and how you can use them to take greater control of your studio and how they can be a secret weapon in a live setup. But what are they, how do they work, and how can you use them? Well, my previous videos on MIDI have had over 200,000 views and helped many people, so stick around as I think you might find this one useful too. On most synths, when you turn a knob like these, or move a fader like these, or when you roll the mod wheel, or even sometimes when you push a button, you're most likely generating MIDI CC messages. But what exactly are CC messages and how do they work? The CC stands for control change and is sometimes referred to as continuous controller. It's a type of MIDI message used to control different parameters like volume, cutoff, resonance or modulation. These messages can be used to control another synth, a VST, or record what is known as automation, which is recording the movement of that parameter in your DAW. For example, a filter sweep. For info, I won't be covering automation in detail today, but I will be doing a video in the future on that. Not only can synths send out CC messages, they can also receive them, meaning they can be remotely controlled by, say, a MIDI controller or your DAW. Here's my Keylab 61 MIDI controller, which I have programmed to do things like control the master cutoff on my matrix brute, control the noise level on my deep mind, and even control the cutoff on a VST on my computer like Omnisphere. Here's a quick rundown of some basic things you need to know. Each MIDI CC message comprises of 3 values: the CC number, the CC value, and the MIDI channel. There are 128 possible MIDI CCs numbered from 0 to 127 in line with standard MIDI protocols, and each of these 128 CCs can operate across a value range also from 0 to 127. For example, the cutoff may have the CC number 74 assigned to it. Turned all the way to the left would equal a MIDI CC value of 0, and turned all the way to the right would equal a value of 127. CCs can also act as a switch to turn something on and off like an effect. For example, let's look at the delay effect on my TC Helicon Voice Live Vocal Effect unit. The delay has a CC number of 117. A CC value associated with that number between 0 to 63 will turn the effect off, and a CC value between 64 to 127 will turn it on. MIDI CCs allow real-time control of their associated parameters. If I program a knob on a MIDI keyboard to transmit the same CC number that's assigned to the master cutoff on my matrix brute, then, as I showed earlier, I can control the matrix brute using the Keylab in real time. Moving the knob on the Keylab will have exactly the same effect as if I had moved the actual knob on the matrix brute. MIDI CCs are also channel specific, so that the same CC number can be used for multiple synths all operating on different channels, or indeed the same knob can be used to operate different functions on different synths. Again, taking my Keylab 61, I can use the same knob to control the cutoff on both my matrix brute or poly brute, depending on which channel I'm sending the message on. And if they were both set to the same channel, I could operate both cutoffs at the same time using one knob on the Keylab. And finally, on these basics, the MIDI Association provides a standard list of MIDI CCs, which you can find from a quick internet search. This website is also a great source of information for MIDI in general. Here's a list of the most common CC numbers, covering things like the mod wheel, volume, sustain, cutoff, etc. Also, if you've seen my video on MIDI program changes, if not, I'll leave a link down below, you'll know that the CC numbers for MSB and LSB are always 0 and 32. All of this is a good place to start, but it's important to consult the manuals for specific gear, as some, in fact many of them, differ from this universal standard. And here's a quick reminder of those basics. Now let's go into a bit more detail. On hardware synths, most of the controls like the knobs and faders and sometimes the buttons will have a MIDI CC number assigned to them. For info, the pitch bend wheel never has a MIDI CC number assigned to it, as it has its own specific sort of MIDI message. This is because it needs more than the range of 0 to 127 in order to operate smoothly. Otherwise you'd get a stepping effect as you bent pitches. Here, for example, is the layout of my polybrute, and you can see which controls have CC numbers assigned to them and what those numbers are. As you can see, nearly every knob and slider has a number assigned to it, meaning all of these parameters can be controlled from somewhere else, can be used themselves to control something else, or their automation can be recorded into your DAW. If your synth responds to CCs, you'll generally find a list of how they're assigned in the MIDI implementation section of the user manual for your synth. And just to connect the dots to something I mentioned earlier, you can see here that the master cutoff on the polybrute has a CC number of 27, whereas the standard list shows CC 74 as the cutoff. This is because the polybrute actually has 3 cutoffs that you can use due to its dual filter architecture. The master cutoff, seen here with a CC number of 27, the Steiner filter cutoff with a CC number of 81, and the ladder filter cutoff with a CC number of 85. What we have to remember is that MIDI is a pretty old protocol, and synths have come a long way since its first inception. Manufacturers have to work within the constraints of this design when automating controls, which, as mentioned earlier, leads to a wide variety of differences on what CC numbers are assigned to what knobs or sliders on different synths. Now, I did say earlier that most hardware synths can send and respond to CC messages, but there are some that can't, like my Behringer Neutron here or my Behringer Pro 1. And so on these, they can't be controlled remotely, or they can't control other things, and they can't have their automation recorded. If you want to affect the sound on either of these synths, you have to tweak the knobs directly on the synthesizers themselves. When it comes to VSTs, or software synths, they also respond to CC messages, with some giving full access to and the ability to edit the CC assignments, while others use a simplified MIDI learn functionality to sync external synths or MIDI controllers with the knobs and sliders on the software synth. For example, here is my Korg Poly 6 VST, and if I right click a control and choose Control Change, you can see this has the CC number 74 assigned to it. And if I have a knob on a MIDI controller set to transmit CC 74, as I have on my Keystep 37 here, I can use it to control the virtual knob on the Poly 6 VST. So you'll see as I turn this knob on the Keystep 37, the cutoff on the Korg Poly 6 VST will move in line with me moving the physical knob. Likewise, in Arturia synths like Pigments here, I can go to the MIDI section and see the assignments, which can be edited or added to as necessary. And then I can program those relevant CC numbers to a knob or a fader on a physical MIDI controller. Other VSTs don't give you access to the CC numbers, but rely on something called MIDI Learn. This allows you to choose a parameter on that VST and then learn that control on another MIDI controller or synth. For example, let's say I wanted to control the master cutoff here in Omnisphere with my Keystep 37. I right click on the parameter I want and click on MIDI CC Learn, and then I just turn whichever knob I want to be associated with that on my key step. And hey presto, as you'll see, the master cutoff in Omnisphere responds when I move the knob on my key step 37. And practically all VSTs have some form of MIDI learn functionality or a way in which to edit and assign the MIDI CC numbers. Now, I've talked a lot about controlling things using MIDI CCs, but I'd just like to clarify what equipment can be used to control what. In essence, there's really two types of controllers. Actual hardware synths that generate their own sounds, like my MODX8 Plus, my Matrix Brute, my Poly Brute, or my DeepMind 12. Or dedicated MIDI controllers like my Keylab 61, my KeyStep Pro, or my KeyStep 37. None of those last three make any sound on their own, but can be used to control hardware synths or VSTs, and I use them extensively in my studio to do just that. There is some equipment though that blurs the lines a little bit, primarily designed as a MIDI controller or sequencer, but also have their own internal sound engines, like the MPC-1 from Akai, seen on the left here, or the circuit tracks from Novation, seen on the right. Well, now that we've covered what CCs are and how they work, let's look further at how you can use them. The most extensive use of using MIDI CCs to control things in my studio is with my trusty old Arturia Keylab 61 here, or my Behringer FCB 1010 MIDI pedal board. Not only do I have my Keylab set up to control all of my hardware synths and various VSTs, but I've also programmed the knobs and the faders to control various functions on those synths when I've got them selected. For info, I'll be doing a separate video on exactly how I've set all this up on the Keylab 61, but for now, I'll show you what it does. First, I have the Keylab set up so that I can easily move between my synths and VSTs using the snapshot buttons on the top of the synth. Snapshot button 1 is the MODX. Snapshot 2 is my Matrix Brute. Snapshot 3 is my DeepMind. Snapshot 4 is my Poly Brute. Snapshot 5 is then Omnisphere within my DAW. Snapshot 6 is actually one of my Steinberg VSTs, Retro Log. Snapshot 7 is my Korg VST, I'm using the Poly 6. Snapshot 8 is one of my Roland VSTs. And Snapshot 9 is my Arturia Analog Lab. Let's take my Matrix Brute to start with. I have the top row of 5 knobs on the Keylab controlling various functions on the Steiner filter, which are cutoff, resonance, drive, brute factor and envelope amount. The second row of knobs controls similar functions on the second ladder filter. The first 4 faders are linked to the VCF ADSR faders on the Matrix Brute. The next 4 faders are then linked to the VCA ADSR faders. And the final master fader is linked to the master cutoff on the Matrix Brute. I've then done similar for my Poly Brute and my DeepMind 12, so that whichever synth the Keylab 61 is set to play, the MIDI CC functions are all set up for that specific synth. I can't do this with my Neutron and my Pro 1 over here. As I mentioned earlier, they don't respond to MIDI CCs, and so therefore I can't control their parameters like cutoff and resonance, etc. using the Keylab. I've also then set up various CCs for my main VSTs, so I can control them using my Keylab 61 without having to always drag a mouse around on the computer. In addition to the Keylab 61 controlling loads of stuff, I also have my FCB 1010 MIDI pedal board programmed to operate a number of things, like changing scenes or operating the super knob on my MODX, or triggering and choosing effects on my Voice Live vocal effect unit. And I've done a whole series of videos on the FCB 1010 and how you can program it to operate other pieces of equipment, and you'll find a playlist on that on my channel. Having everything programmed like this is great and provides loads of flexibility in my workflow in the studio, but remembering what controls what can be a bit of a pain. So I've developed myself a couple of cheat sheets. Here's the sheet for my Keylab 61, where you can see which synths are assigned to which snapshot button on the Keylab, and then for each one what the knobs and faders on the Keylab remotely control, along with details of the actual CC numbers or whether they are assigned using MIDI Learn, and in the case of Arturia's Analog Lab, using the default auto mapping, as the Keylab 61 is designed to work seamlessly with Analog Lab out of the box. In the case of the MODX, you'll see that this is all greyed out, as I don't have any of the CCs for it programmed on the Keylab. This is because, as the Keylab is positioned directly above the MODX, I can easily use the controls on itself to manipulate the sounds. I just use the keys on the Keylab sometimes to trigger the MODX, as some patches are more comfortably played with synth keys rather than weighted hammer action piano keys. For example, things like synth leads when performing fast runs. And here's the sheet for my FCB 1010, showing all the different banks of presets on it, what foot switches are mapped to what functions and on what gear, again along with the relevant CC numbers, etc. For example, you can see here in the first bank, switches 1 to 8 choose the scenes, foot switch 9 turns the arpeggiator on and off, and foot switch 10 changes the expression pedal functions so that they can operate the assignable 1 and assignable 2 switches instead of the super knob and modulation wheel. But why do all this? Well, the way I work, I spend a lot of time sitting at my MODX, as this is what I use as my main composing tool, and I use the Keylab above it for messing around with accompanying sounds. And as we've seen, this setup allows me to use the Keylab to control any other one of the synths in my studio or VSTs on my computer without having to continually move around from keyboard to keyboard or go backwards and forwards to the computer. Also, the use of MIDI CCs can be very handy in a live situation where you may have multiple keyboards on stage or lots of different synth rack modules or lots of different VSTs on a laptop. If you wanted to tweak the sounds of any of these in real time, you'd have to go and tweak the knobs on each individual synthesizer as you were playing, or indeed on the software synthesizers on your laptop, and it could be a bit of a logistical nightmare. However, using MIDI CCs, you can do it all from one main MIDI or synth controller. Well, that's about it. That's how I use MIDI CCs in my studio to control things. As mentioned earlier, I'll leave a link in the description to some playlists of some videos that I've mentioned during this one, and I'll be doing a video in the future on exactly how I set up my Keylab 61 to control all of these things. Although that will just be one specific example, other MIDI keyboards do have similar functionality and the ability to set them up in a similar sort of way. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell, as it really is appreciated. If you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments and I will get back to you. Indeed, any other comments or feedback are most welcome. But for now, I've been Graham, take care and catch you later.